Thank you for your kind introduction. First, I hope you all have a handout of my lecture. It is useful to follow the order of my talk and to read the quotations I will comment on. Before I begin, I have to make a confession. It's like the starting his paper. I made a confession about the title, The Paradox of Created Freedom. It's usually you formulate a title months before writing the actual paper. So when I was writing the paper, I thought, paradox. I can't remember what I meant by using the term paradox. This maybe is not the right term. I think at the background, it's about creation, about God and human freedom. And I think for many, there will not a paradox, but a straight-on contradiction between both poles, or both terms. God and human freedom cannot go together. Either God exists and then there's no human freedom, or human freedom and then God cannot exist. So I think for many it seems to be a contradiction. What I want to argue in my paper is that, in my view, God, creation, is not so much standing not so much in a contradiction with human freedom, but is an essential condition of human freedom. That is what I try to show you, that creation is an essential condition of human freedom. Okay. So the question I want to discuss here is that of human freedom, its nature and possibility within the context of creation. What does it mean for a human being to be truly free? And how is God, if at all, present in this freedom? I'm going to approach this question from the perspective of Thomas Aquinas, not a surprise, by showing how he understands the human act of will and the freedom implied by it, and the presence of God as enabling, in some sense, that act of freedom. I hope you will allow me on this conference dedicated to the future of Christian thinking to go back to Thomas. Of course, I'm interested not so much in the Aquinas of the past, but rather in a possible future of that past. How can it help us to understand the freedom which is at the beating heart of the Christian experience of God's love and the human answer to this divine love as revealed to us in Jesus Christ? In the background of my interest in the idea of created freedom lies a feeling of wonder or worry about how in our modern world people, on the one hand, have serious doubts about whether they are really free in a meaningful way, doubts induced by the current naturalistic interpretation of human nature, while on the other hand, they used to have an excessive conception of freedom as the expression of the sovereign self, unwilling to accept conditions of restraint imposed on it by the world they live in. So I found an acute description of the problem of freedom in our time in an article by Reinhard Hütter, the Catholic theologian living in the United States. I quote, "The late modern subject vacillates between two competing self-images, between, on the one side, what might be called the Gnostic angelism of the sovereign self, that may submit to its will an absolutely malleable and fluid exteriority, and on the other side, the materialistic animalism of the superprimate allegedly determined by its genetic makeup and its particular ecological niche. The utopian existentialist self-image of the sovereign subject and the competing dystopian naturalist self-image of the superprimate constantly destabilize each other, precisely because they are nothing other than two contradictory effects brought about by the modern anthropocentric turn. Thus, we have, on the one hand, an image of ourselves as a contingent outcome of a process of natural evolution, and on the other hand, a very powerful understanding, conception of the free subject, not embodied in this world, as an embodied free subject. This is by way of introduction. So, in the light of this image of the sovereign self, we may ask whether freedom can be understood as a gift. Is freedom a gift? Or should we be afraid that a given freedom will make us dependent upon external authority, who will include in this gift a law, which deprives us of our autonomy. So freedom may be a gift, but with a kind of instruction how to use the freedom, this law. Is real freedom not rather the result of a struggle of emancipation or liberation? Is freedom not always a conquest? Is freedom not I made myself free, in essence? In Christianity, freedom is essentially regarded as a gift, and this in a double sense. First, in the sense of grace, the gift through which the human self is open to God, made open to God, and finds in God, in the love of God, the highest fulfillment of its freedom. And second, prior to and presupposed by grace, the gift of being. As created, the will is open to the good, is free to do the good, to respond to its appeal. If freedom is an essential condition of being human, if it belongs to how we humans are and how we act through ourselves, then it must have its enabling condition in the creation of that being. But then, how can the free will be an effect of a creation? If creation means total dependency. And usually creation is conceived in terms of total dependency. Many will see a huge problem here. Freedom, self-initiated movement of the will, free from external influence, this master of itself, and at the same time totally dependent on an external cause. Is this not a contradiction? Now, one may respond to this, first of all, by pointing out that creation, for Aquinas, is certainly not only a total of absolute dependency. Creation must be understood in terms of participation. And participation entails in its concept a synthesis of total dependency and the substantial character of the creature with its own being in its own mode of operation. I was looking for a word, and in Dutch we use the word zelfstandig. In German is selbstständig. If you look in the dictionary for the English translations of the German selbstständig, you will see the word independent. It cannot be the case that creation is the unity of total dependency and being independent. But still, from another perspective, you should say participation means the unity of total dependency and Selbstständigkeit. Selbstständigkeit in the Thomistic sense of substance, standing in itself, existing in itself. And so from this perspective, a creature is a being in its own right. Now, this synthetic character of creation in terms of participation, that will my lead in the following considerations. And let us begin with the text from the Summa contra Gentiles, in which Thomas argues that God is the cause of the will, not only of the power of the will, but even of the motion of the will. The motion of the will, which is his actual exercise. In other words, God not only gives us the capacity of will, he also does the willing in us. This sounds very problematic in our modern ears. If God does the willing in us, what remains for us to do? We do not merely want to be puppets of some master will. Freedom means, if in anything at all, doing the willing by myself. I am the actor of my will, following the rule of reason. God cannot take the place of my own self. Or to make the situation even worse, Thomas quotes the famous text of St. Paul in the letter to the Philippians. I quote, "For it is God who works in us to will and to accomplish." So finding an acceptable interpretation of this statement presents a real challenge. Some, Thomas says, could not understand how God can cause the movement of the will in us without prejudice to the freedom of the will, the libertas voluntatis. The freedom of our will, it seems, would be denied when God does the willing in us. For many, it seems to be evident there can be only one actor who does the willing. And Thomas cites a remark of Origen, who writes in his De Principiis, I quote, "Some maintain that if to will and to accomplish is of God, or if, whether we act of desire well or ill, it be of God, then if this is the case, we are not free." End of the quote. So the dominant way of thinking seems to be either God wills or we will ourselves. And if God does the willing in us, then the willing is not initiated by us. In a footnote to this passage, the editor of the English online translation of the Summa contra Gentiles refers to the debate on free will and grace in the early modern period between the Thomist and the Molinist. In this debate, Louis de Molina is often pictured as defending a humanistic position. He clearly felt the need to protect human freedom from a too powerful intrusion of the sovereign will of God. His doctrine of the middle knowledge, too complex for me to expose here, is an attempt to defend that our free decisions of the will are something from God to be reckoned with. to be reckoned with in a providential distribution of his grace. So according to de Molina, we are not merely puppets of an all-powerful deity, but we have in ourselves a sort of safe place of relative freedom. Now, in modern philosophy, there's a returning worry about the place of human freedom in the world under the rule of an all-powerful God. The classical idea of providence has undergone in the early modern time a deterministic, mechanistic turn, leading to an image of the world as a totalitarian whole closed in itself. Nothing can happen outside God's all-determining will. There's consequently no room for true freedom, and the sequence of events in the world follows a fixed divine scenario, like in Diderot's and Jacques the Fatalist in son Maître. More recent, one can think of Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, and Sartre with his radical understanding of freedom in a certain sense, for an existentialist freedom to assert itself, there must be a meaningless universe surrounding that freedom. And there is next thing, there is the old story, still attractive for many, from the Kabbalah, or about the idea of the Zimzum. Zimzum is going back to Isaac Luria in the 16th century. Zimzum meaning something like the divine retreat. In order to create room for something else, God must retreat in himself. Underlying this image is the assumption that where God is, nothing else can be, nothing else can exist. Human freedom cannot coexist with an omnipresent God who cannot tolerate, it seems, another reality out besides himself. Now the modern struggle of coming to an open world in which human freedom can assert itself in its own right has led to the final abolishment of the old regime of the omnipotent and sovereign deity, an image which then reappears, paradoxically, in a dream of our own sovereign freedom, a freedom which dreams of making myself, of defining my own identity. Good. For it is God who works in us to will, to accomplish. What can we learn from Thomas in understanding this view of God, enabling us to will freely whatever we will? Now, if we want to follow Thomas in this approach to the human will, we must consider 2 points. First, the object of the will, it is the good, under the general aspect of the good. And second, that it is this so-called transcendental openness of the will, which is the ground of its freedom. Let us first consider the object of the will. It is my experience as a teacher that students are not easily convinced of the fact that only the good can positively be willed. Trying to explain the thesis of the good as formal object of the will, I am often confronted with the objection that we can will whatever we want. The will chooses an object as it likes. That is precisely why it is a free power. So most students think about the will in more or less this way. The scholastic thesis assumes that the good is the formal object of the will, which means that something can only be willed insofar as it is apprehended under the aspect of the good. Now, from this perspective, The will is not so much a spontaneous force under the control of the free self, but rather a faculty which is moved or motivated in its act of willing by that good. What is evil or bad cannot be positively willed. And some will protest then what they see as an unfounded preference of the will for the good. We see people doing evil or bad things, and apparently with free consent. This the will, one contends, moves itself towards an object of its own choice. That an object, in virtue of its intrinsic goodness, may move the will, then seems to conflict with the assumed autonomy of the will. Hence, many tend to conceive the will as a neutral power. They regard it as basically free to choose whatever it desires, not constrained by the quality of the good on the part of the object. Since the good, and this is another widespread assumption, is not an inherent property of things, a quality of the being of things, but rather it is taken to express how things are experienced or valued by us. Good is the expression of what pleases our will. The issue of the will in its relation to the good must be approached from the perspective of the doctrine of the transcendentals. That's the true, the good, and the one. So whatever is true, good, and one. The transcendentals are the pillars of a metaphysical worldview. They express the fundamental harmony between the world and the human spirit. Anima quoda modo omnia, and the soul is in a certain way everything. Another idea, I think, important for the future of Christian thinking. The perspective of the transcendentals shows us the world as ultimately not a meaningless chaos in which we feel at a loss. The often painful experience of evil and suffering cannot undo the transcendental primacy of the good. Otherwise, that experience could not be painful and abhorrent. For Thomas, the possibility of exercising our free will in a meaningful way in this world presupposes the transcendental context of the good. And the transcendental openness of the will is the ground for our freedom. When we look for the exact locus of freedom in Thomas' account of human agency, it appears that freedom has a double focus. It is partly situated in a reason, but must specify the good as the object of the will. And it is partly situated in the will itself, which has the power to exercise itself freely with respect to the good as presented to us by reason. Freedom is therefore not only a matter of practical reason, deliberating and determining the good presented to the will also moves itself in terms of the execution of the act. It is this aspect of the self-movement of the will which needs some clarification. The self-movement of the will, Thomas says, is not unconditional or absolute. The will is not simply a spontaneous movement from within. In order to be able to move itself, the will must be an act. But the will, in Thomas' view, is not always, and as such, an act, ready to will whatever it wills, as is the case with Spinoza conatus and conatus essendi, or the will in Schopenhauer. And Schopenhauer's will is always willing. It cannot stop willing with difficulty. And it has its own internal energy of willing. And Spinoza, conatus might be seen as the paradigm of the modern will. So it's an active force which keeps willing. Now for Thomas, the self-movement of the will must be understood in this way, that the will moves itself to the extent that by willing an end, it brings itself to will the means to that end. It moves itself to will something in view of something else which is already actually wills. For instance, when something wills to become healthy, he begins to think about to accomplish this end. And through this deliberation, it arrives at the conclusion that he can be made healthy by a physician. And then he wills this as a means to an end. He decides to consult a physician as something which derived is desirability of goodness from the per se desired end of health. So he wills or desires a particular object insofar as this object is recognized as good. That means as fulfilling his basic will or appetite for the good. So given the fact that this process of deliberation about the means and about the will moving itself to will the means necessarily presupposes some prior end, and ultimately an end which is not itself selected by the will moving itself, there must be a first movement by which the will as such is set into motion. So there is at the heart of the will a fundamental passivity, in the sense that it is a moved self-mover. It is important to acknowledge and to see this passivity. Thomas claims that the will has the capacity to move itself only insofar as it is, at a more fundamental level, moved by an exterior principle. The will is first set into motion, as it were, by the impulse of an exterior mover. For this, Thomas refers to the famous passage in the Eudemian Ethics of Aristotle, where Aristotle argues for the necessity of positing a starting point of all deliberation of reason in the soul. Now, such a starting point, he says, both in the universe as a whole and in the soul, must be God. I quote, "For, in a sense, the divine element in us moves everything." Now, we are now coming closer to the answer to our question, or at least to some insightful elements for an answer. God moves the will, according to Aquinas, in the sense that he enables the will to move itself. That's the basic idea. Not as substituting the will in itself, but in a creative sense. So as making the self-movement of the will possible. But the self-movement of the will is not unconditional. The will must receive, Thomas says, some impulse by which it is moved in the first act. And only then, by being an act, it can move itself in a sequence of deliberation and choice. Now, for Thomas, that first impulse definitely comes from God. This raises some difficulty. How can freedom, the free movement of the will that proceeds from within, be reconciled with an impulse from without, even if that impulse comes from God? If freedom essentially consists in a self-initiated movement of the will from within, how can this be compatible with the influence of an exterior principle? Such an external influence is often associated with chance or fate. The will is then moved in a way it cannot control by itself. It undergoes an influence which weakens the autonomy and the self-responsibility of the will. An influence which somehow happens to the will. Now, as a possible instance of such an external influence, we could think of the heavenly stars. Our fate is then written in the stars. One may compare this maybe with the type of influence exercised nowadays by algorithms, preparing and steering our will in our daily choices, of which we are not quite sure if they are really our choices. How then can God be the enabling cause of our willing? If the external influence of the stars is unacceptable for Thomas, how then can that other exterior move, which is God, be the very condition of the possibility of human freedom? Here at the end of question 9 of the Prima Secundae of the Summa Theologiae, is that the text on which I based my talk, Thomas comes with his interpretation, with his interpretation of the statement by St. Paul, it is God who works in us to will and to accomplish. Now, what is his interpretation? One must say, so Thomas begins his argument, that nothing but God himself can be the external cause of the will. The basic reason is that God is not some particular reality, moving the will as one entity, another entity, but God is the cause of the will in a twofold sense. First, as creator, the power of the will as part of the rational soul is caused solely by God through creation. Second, that's the more important part for Thomas. Second, God can also be said to be the cause of the will, and I quote, insofar as the will is ordered toward the universal good. And so nothing can be the cause of the will except God, who is the universal good. End of the quote. So God is said to be the cause of the willing of the will, insofar as the universal good is what makes the will, in each of its acts, able to will as such. I think this is a difficult point. Yeah? It is the universal good what makes the will, in each of its acts, willing some particular good, able to will as such. And the will from this perspective is characterized by the inclination to the universal good. Moreover, or maybe better, the will is such a universal inclination, extending to the whole domain of objects which exemplify to some extent the value of the good. And it is thanks to this inclination, this openness toward the good, in its universal extension, that the will can have a proper operation with respect to particular goods. If we will or desire some object, we must first recognize that object as good, that is, as fulfilling our inclination. Thus, given its universal inclination, the will opens up to the domain of particular goods, which it can choose or will or not to will in the light of the universal good. Now, the notion of the universal good, bonum universale, contains a characteristic ambiguity. It signifies the formal object of the will, the good in its universal extension, and it also signifies that being in which the universal character of the good is fully realized. That is God. Therefore, God is said to be the universal good. And as such, only God can establish the will in its inclination towards the universal good. In the formulation of Aquinas, I quote, God moves the human will as a universal mover with respect to the universal object of the will, the good. Without this universal motion, a human person would be unable to will anything. But it is through his reason a man determines himself to willing this or that, which is either a real good or an apparent good. End of the quote. He chooses the particular good of which he thinks that it fulfills the universal inclination for the good of the will. And in this sense, it is in this sense that God can be regarded as the exterior principle of the will, giving the will its first impulse toward the good. It's like from the inclination to the good. This is the reason why it's so important. The will cannot decide by itself to will the good. The will can only decide to will something on basis of that presupposed inclination to the good. I think that is the basic argument here. But this does not mean that God makes us always choose something that is really good. The active presence of God in our willing, I think you should formulate it in this way, the active presence of always according to the scheme of participation, the active presence of God in our willing does not sanctify that will so that any wrongdoing would be impossible. That is not the case. If I will some apparent good, the only reason why I will some apparent good is that I think that it is good. In conclusion, according to Aquinas, the will is defined by its relationship to the universal good. That means that it is only able to function against the horizon of the good, being the condition of the possibility for the will to act freely. One cannot choose to will the good from a priori neutral standpoint, since from such a neutral standpoint, there is no possible motivation to will anything at all. The will cannot create its first motivation from scratch, ex nihilo. It must already be moved toward the good. Only then it can move itself, after deliberation of reason, to will this of that particular good. This is something we can take with us, I think, on the way to the future. Maybe it's an interesting idea to create some box and to put all the things, ideas of which we think that they are important for the future, and to put in the box and to take the box with us to the future. So now thank you for your attention.